The terminal at Denver International buzzed like any other weekday morning. Businessmen tapping at laptops, vacationers wrangling luggage, and gate agents repeating boarding announcements like clockwork. Among them was a quiet woman in jeans, a light jacket, and hiking boots, stepping calmly through Gate 26 with a coffee in hand and a well-worn backpack slung over one shoulder. To most eyes, she was just another traveler, just another seat on Flight 982 to Seattle. Her name was Megan Hale, and she preferred it that way. She took her seat at the window 17A and tucked her bag beneath the seat in front of her. Tray table up, phone on airplane mode, seatbelt clicked. The rhythm of travel was almost meditative for her now. As the morning sun danced across the tarmac, Megan leaned back and exhaled, watching the ground crew wave wands and refuel jets like nothing in the world could go wrong. No one around her knew that Megan had once worn a different kind of uniform, one stitched not with airline wings, but with the insignia of the United States Air Force. No one knew she'd spent 4 years at the academy, completed advanced flight training, and flown countless hours in simulators and light aircraft. No one knew she'd been called one of the best natural hands in her class, and no one knew why she walked away. It had been almost 6 years since she last touched real flight controls. She hadn't left the Air Force in disgrace. There was no scandal, just quiet exhaustion. Megan had grown tired of the politics of being told she was too cautious, under pressure, too emotional for leadership. She wanted a simpler life, one that didn't require steel nerves and impossible expectations. So she built a new path: software engineering, freelance consulting, and the occasional visit to her sister up in the Pacific Northwest. That morning flight was supposed to be routine, uneventful, comfortable even. Megan didn't want responsibility anymore, especially not the kind that comes at 35,000 feet. But sometimes the sky has other plans. 2 hours into the flight, turbulence struck. It started light, barely a bump, just enough to make drinks tremble and passengers tighten their seatbelts. Megan felt the slight jolt, but kept reading her book, calm but alert. She always paid attention to the air. That part never left her. Then came the second hit. It wasn't subtle. The entire plane dropped like a stone for 2 long, breathless seconds. Overhead bins popped open. A child screamed. Megan instinctively braced herself against the seat in front of her. The whine of the engines shifted, barely perceptible to most, but not to her. She felt it in her bones. Something was wrong. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, trying to sound calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated." But his voice betrayed him. It was tight. Off rhythm, not turbulence, not just turbulent. She felt a vibration along the floor of the aircraft. Too deep, too uneven, something mechanical, something failing. The oxygen masks hadn't dropped yet. But Megan knew it was only a matter of time. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisles, whispering into phones, checking door panels with more urgency than usual. One of them passed by Megan's row. The woman's knuckles were white around the intercom switch. Megan reached out and touched her arm gently. "What's happening?" she asked. Her tone was even, but firm. The flight attendant looked at her, startled by the directness. She hesitated, then whispered, "They've declared a Level 3 malfunction. One engine's out, and they're having trouble with the second." Megan's mind went still, not blank still, focused. 6 years gone from the cockpit, and still the training surged forward like it had been waiting beneath the surface. Her jaw clenched. She didn't want this. Not now. Not ever again. But the silence in her row, the crying child across the aisle, the terrified man clutching his chest 2 rows back, they changed something in her. This wasn't about her anymore. "I'm a certified pilot," Megan said. "Air Force trained. If they need help, I can give it." The flight attendant froze, looked at her again. This time she saw Megan, not a passenger. Not just a face in 17A, something else. She nodded. "I'll check." Megan sat back, gripping the armrests, trying to calm the adrenaline rising in her chest. She hadn't flown a commercial aircraft, not even in simulations, but basics were basics. Lift, thrust, drag, gravity, calm. Her father used to say, "The sky only respects the calm ones." A minute passed, then 2. The flight attendant returned, eyes wide. "So, pilot's unconscious. Captain Hale wants you in the cockpit." "Now." "Captain Hale." Strange hearing her name like that again. She stood legs steady despite the fear rippling through the cabin. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the weight of every eye, some panicked, others pleading. She passed a young mother whispering prayers, a teenager frozen in his seat, an older man staring straight ahead like it was already over. Megan didn't smile, didn't reassure. But something in her step steadied the cabin, like the presence of someone who knew. At the cockpit door she paused, her hand on the latch. I didn't come here to fly, she thought, but maybe I was meant to. The door opened with a hiss of air and the smell of burning plastic. Inside, red lights blinked across every surface. The pilot, Captain Raymond Doyle, looked up, face drawn and sweating. "You're the passenger?" he asked. "Megan Hale," she said, "former Air Force. Certified instructor. You called." He didn't question it, just nodded and pointed to the co-pilot's seat. The man slumped and it was out cold, oxygen mask over his face, pulse thready. Megan checked him briefly, then slid into the seat. "We've lost the left engine completely," Captain Doyle said. "The right's overheating. Autopilot's fried. Nav systems are glitching. We're 28 minutes from Seattle, but we're not going to make it." Megan's fingers ran over the controls. Some systems were familiar. Others weren't. But the logic still held. The machine wanted to fly. It just needed someone calm enough to guide it. "Okay," she said, slipping on the headset. "Let's steady her up." The aircraft wobbled beneath them. Somewhere out there, past the controls, past the altitude warnings and burning wires, were 181 lives. And somehow, they had all just ended up in her hands. She hadn't flown in years. But the sky remembered her. And more importantly, she remembered how to fly. The moment Megan Hale touched the co-pilot's seat, her past, buried for years beneath layers of civilian routine, came roaring back like a sudden squall over open water. The cockpit wasn't unfamiliar. It was foreign, yes, built for commercial aircraft, not the tactical birds she trained in, but it still spoke the same language: altimeter, artificial horizon, engine status, fuel lines, hydraulic pressure, and every one of them was screaming. Captain Doyle spoke fast, but clearly, his voice clipped with adrenaline. "Left engine's gone, failed completely about 12 minutes ago. We've rerouted emergency power, but the right's overheating. We're losing altitude slow, but steady." He tapped the display panel with his knuckles. "Auto nav is dead. GPS is glitching. TCS isn't showing anything real." Co-pilot passed out after the second drop. Cabin pressure may have hit him hard. Megan nodded once. Her hands were already moving, rebalancing power, disabling faulty auto controls, flipping auxiliary systems to manual. The aircraft vibrated beneath her like a living creature in pain. A warning alarm trilled in low pulses, hydraulic pressure dropping fast. "We're at 29,400 feet, she said. "Where's our nearest reroute?" "Seattle's out of reach with one engine and no climb," Doyle said. "Best estimate. 35 minutes if we coast, but not with this power loss." Megan glanced at the panel again. The right engine's temperature gauge was redlining. At any moment, they could lose thrust entirely. Below them lay the jagged ridges of the Cascades, snow-capped peaks, narrow valleys, and dense pine forest. Not a place you want to go down. Not in a 170-ton aircraft with 181 souls on board. Megan didn't panic, she assessed. First descent. They needed to stabilize and drop in a controlled path, burn altitude while conserving fuel. Second, glide range. If they lost the right engine, their only chance was to coast into something, anything flat enough to land. Third, crowd control. A screaming cabin above a wounded aircraft only made things harder. "I need terrain," she said. "Old military or decommissioned airstrips. Anything off-grid." Doyle handed her a backup flight tablet, barebones offline maps and coordinates. Megan scanned fast. She knew this region well enough. Years ago, she'd trained in emergency landings over simulated terrain just like this. "There," she pointed. "Mackenzie Ridge. Decommissioned Cold War airfield. Not on commercial maps, but it's there." Doyle raised an eyebrow. "You're sure? Short runway. Probably overgrown. But it's within glide range barely." Outside the cockpit, the situation deteriorated. The lights in the cabin flickered. A second jolt rocked the aircraft, prompting oxygen masks to drop. Flight attendants tried to stay composed, but passengers were sobbing, shouting, praying. One woman fainted. A toddler screamed as his mother clutched him tight, and above them, in the sealed cockpit, two people fought the clock. Megan adjusted the manual trim. The control yoke groaned under her grip. "We need to descend more aggressively," she said. "We'll come in hot, but we have no choice. No flaps," Doyle muttered. "Hydraulics are too far gone. We'll do it by hand," she said. The aircraft began to level off slightly as they descended past 25,000 feet. Outside, snow danced across the windshield like ash in the wind. A faint shimmer appeared on the horizon, Mackenzie Ridge. Megan narrowed her eyes. It looked like a scar carved into the forest. She toggled the emergency beacon, one final ping through a backup transponder. Maybe someone nearby would catch it. Meanwhile, she rerouted power from galley systems and non-essential avionics to keep the main flight surfaces responsive. It wasn't enough, but it might buy them time. The aircraft now flew manually, every movement translating into creaks and moans from aging machinery. It was no longer a commercial jet. It was a massive glider with one limping engine. "We're going in without confirmed gear," Doyle warned. "Indicators dead." Megan reached for the manual landing gear release. Click, clunk. She felt a shudder beneath her feet. "Gear 1, maybe 2. She muttered, "We'll need visual confirmation." Doyle switched on a backup camera, a grainy black and white view of the undercarriage. One wheel looked extended. The others unclear. But it was all they had. "Altitude?" she asked. 8,000. "Ridge is at 3,200 feet. We're 5 minutes out." "Throttle steady. Begin flare at 200 feet. But if the gear collapses, we skid." "Copy that." And then they saw it, faint lights, flashing in uneven intervals. Emergency responders from the nearby town, maybe a fire crew, had set up makeshift runway markers using headlights, lanterns, anything they could find. A small crowd gathered behind barricades, watching with awe and dread. The cabin grew deathly quiet. Passengers clutched armrests, others held hands. Some whispered final words. Some simply stared out the windows at the endless trees rushing beneath them. None of them knew the woman now guiding the plane had been told years ago she wasn't suited for pressure. They were about to learn otherwise. "We'll clear the treetops by a few dozen feet," Megan said. "Wind's calm, but cross drift could spin us." "Ready when you are." Megan wrapped both hands around the yoke. Her jaw clenched. Her shoulders were tight, but her eyes stayed calm. "Final approach," she whispered. The aircraft cut through low cloud, dipping into view of the cracked, narrow strip of concrete. The nose tipped upward, just enough to bleed speed. The engine sputtered one last time before going silent. Now it was all glide. Megan held the line. Trimmed the angle. Watched the ground rush upward. Impact. The front gear struck hard. Sparks erupted from the fuselage. The rear wheels slammed down with a scream of shredded rubber. The jet bounced, once, twice, then skidded violently. Smoke poured from the underside. The cabin filled with cries and crashing sounds. 40 feet before the forest edge, the aircraft screeched to a halt. For a moment, there was no sound at all. Then, from the back of the cabin, a small voice, "Did we just land?" And the plane, full of terrified strangers, erupted in applause. For most passengers on Flight 982, the worst moment had already arrived. The masks had dropped. The plane had jolted and screamed. The lights flickered like a bad dream. People had prayed, cried, and in some cases, given up hope altogether. But in the cockpit, where life and death now boiled down to blinking lights and burning circuits, Megan Hale was just getting started. She leaned into the right-hand seat, the co-pilot seat, without hesitation. The man who should have been there was still slumped over, pulse barely there, breathing weak and shallow. A pressure event, most likely. Oxygen loss or stress-induced blackout. Either way, he was out of the fight. Megan reached for the headset. The familiar weight settled over her ears like a memory. "Captain Doyle," she said, voice steady, "I've got the right seat. Let's fly this thing." Doyle, face drawn, uniform soaked with sweat, nodded once. "Glad you're here." They didn't waste time with questions. No one asked for credentials, rank, or history. They didn't have that kind of time. The left engine had failed entirely. No power, no restart. The right engine was overheating and climbing wasn't an option. Hydraulic pressure was critically low, flaps unresponsive. Autopilot was dead. And the flight navigation system, the very brain of the aircraft, was glitching out like a broken compass. The plane was flying wounded, barely, and the only thing keeping it aloft now was instinct. Megan's fingers flew over the switches. She rerouted power from cabin systems to maintain minimal thrust and flight surface control. The plane's attitude was nose low, dropping at a shallow but steady angle. "We need to flatten the descent," she said. "I've tried trim and stabilizer," Doyle replied. "Only partial response. Manual override? Only if you want to shear the tail off?" Megan nodded once. "Copy. We'll go soft on the yoke. Try to coax it into glide." She gently pulled back, barely a breath of motion. The yoke trembled in her hands, warning her the aircraft was near stall speed. But the nose began to lift just slightly. Out the windshield, the snow-lined ridges of the Cascades loomed, massive, unforgiving. Not one of them looked even remotely suitable for landing. And Seattle, their original destination, was now far beyond reach. They were gliding on borrowed air. "Terrain confirmation," she asked. Doyle gestured to the backup tablet in his lap. "Mackenzie Ridge Cold War relic. It's rough. Short. Half the systems don't even recognize it anymore." "It'll do," Megan said. Doyle glanced over at her eyes, scanning her hands on the controls. "You sure about this?" "No," she answered. "But I'm more sure of it than crashing into trees." They both half laughed, sharp, humorless, but real. Sometimes the only way to stay sane at 20,000 feet in a burning aircraft is to say the obvious out loud. Back in the main cabin, the chaos had quieted into something far worse: a silence. Passengers sat locked in their seats, many with eyes closed, others murmuring prayers. One older man had tears running down his cheeks. A mother clutched her infant to her chest, rocking back and forth. No one knew what was happening in the cockpit. No one knew a passenger had taken control. Megan reached up and toggled a fail-safe switch, rerouting whatever power remained from the right engine into the flight stabilizers. She could feel the vibration under her boots shift slightly. Not fixed, but manageable. "We've got one shot," she said. "There's no second pass." "I know," Doyle said. "And Megan, thank you." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Not yet. Not while the weight of 181 lives sat just inches behind her. Megan adjusted the headset mic. "Cabin crew, prepare for emergency landing. Run final checks. Brace positions." Down below, the faint outline of Mackenzie Ridge came into view, barely a scratch of concrete in a sea of dark green. But someone had heard the emergency ping. Makeshift lights, car headlights, flares, even what looked like construction lanterns, lined the old airstrip in broken rows. Emergency responders, perhaps from the nearby town, had arrived. "We'll come in hot," she said. "Landing gear?" Doyle asked. She reached for the manual deployment lever. Pulled. The aircraft groaned. "One down," she muttered, visual on the rest. Doyle tapped a side screen. Grainy black and white feed flickered. One wheel extended fully. The other two were uncertain and complete. Maybe locked. Maybe not. "Do we abort?" he asked. Megan didn't answer immediately. She looked at the cracked screen, the smoke curling from the control panel, the face of a man who'd flown for decades and now handed his fate to her. "No," she said. "We'll land. You hold back. I'll fly." Doyle looked at her, really looked. And slowly, he took his hands off the yoke. That's when everything else fell away. No more lights. No more alarms. No more doubt. Just Megan. The woman who had once walked away from the Air Force because someone told her she couldn't handle pressure. The woman who had spent years behind a desk instead of a cockpit. The woman who had bought a coach seat that morning, hoping for a quiet flight. She was no longer a passenger. The landing lights came into full view. The ground rushed upward. The right engine gave out. Glide only now. Megan adjusted the wings manually. Nose up, angle down just enough to avoid stalling. She could feel the aircraft's every groan and twitch as if it were her own body. Her eyes locked on the strip ahead. "Come on, girl," she whispered. And then, impact. The front wheels hit first hard. The cabin screamed. Sparks flew. The rear gear slammed down, wobbling, unsure. Tires tore apart. Rubber and metal scraped violently against the uneven tarmac. They bounced once, skidded. Brakes, manual only. Megan gripped the levers and pulled. Smoke erupted from the rear. Oxygen masks swayed in the cabin. Passengers were thrown forward, restrained by belts. The aircraft roared its final protest and came to a full stop just 43 feet from the forest's edge. Then silence. And in that silence a child whispered, "Did we just land?" And the cabin erupted into sobs, cheers, disbelief. But in the cockpit, Megan didn't react. She sat there, hands still on the yoke, breathing hard. Captain Doyle turned toward her, voice cracked. "You didn't just land a plane. You brought a world home." Megan didn't respond right away, because she knew, deep in her bones, this wasn't a miracle. It was what she was always meant to do. Megan Hale didn't flinch when the right engine failed completely. The low rumble disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the cockpit like fog. The aircraft was now a 170-ton glider, coasting over the Cascade Mountains with only the raw force of momentum and a pilot who hadn't flown in 6 years keeping it from becoming a tragedy. Captain Doyle looked at her, face pale, hands gripping the edge of his seat. "We've lost all thrust," he muttered. Megan nodded, her eyes scanning the gauges, instinct overriding fear. "We still have glide." Barely. The makeshift lights below, set up by local responders who had received the emergency ping, twinkled like fallen stars along the cracked concrete of Mackenzie Ridge. Once a Cold War airstrip, it hadn't seen action in decades. Overgrown with weeds, littered with potholes, it was never meant for commercial jets. But it was all they had. "Altitude's dropping fast," Doyle said, checking the instruments. "We're at 6,000 feet and falling. We've got one pass," Megan said. "No room to circle. No time to second guess." She reached up and silenced the final wave of cockpit alarms, gear warnings, hydraulic faults, stall alerts. The systems had already said all they needed to say. From here on out, it was judgment, instinct, and grace under pressure. "Visual on the gear," she asked. Doyle flipped the backup inspection camera to a grainy black and white feed. "Front wheels down. Left main gear looks maybe. Right side's not visible." She exhaled sharply. "Partial gear. If one leg collapses, we'll spin off the runway. If we miss the runway, we won't." The ground rushed upward. Through the front glass, Megan saw the tarmac. Just over 3,000 feet of cracked concrete ahead. Flares lined the edges. Fire crews waited at both ends. It wasn't enough, but it was enough. It had to be. "Final approach," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She eased the nose down, careful not to drop too quickly. The rudder stiffened under her foot, protesting every adjustment. They were flying just above stall speed, threading a needle through the crosswinds. In the cabin, passengers were bracing. A child sobbed softly. A woman whispered the Lord's Prayer. And not one of them knew the person guiding them to the ground had been seated among them just 40 minutes earlier. Megan's grip on the yoke was iron steady. Her breath slowed. Her eyes didn't blink. "Come on," she said under her breath. "Stay with me." The moment stretched out like slow motion. At just under 300 feet, the wheels kissed the treetops. At 150 feet, the runway lined up in full view, looking far smaller than it had from altitude. At 50 feet, Megan cut the last remaining power and flared the nose up slightly. It was the textbook move, but with no thrust and questionable gear, it was also a gamble. Impact. The front wheel struck first, harder than she wanted. A jolt shook the cabin. Passengers screamed. The rear wheels followed, smashing into the cracked pavement with a thunderous metallic screech. Tires shredded instantly. Sparks exploded beneath the fuselage. The aircraft bounced once, twice. The right side gear buckled with a sickening crunch. The plane veered hard left, tires dragging, metal screaming against pavement. Smoke billowed from the rear. The tail twisted slightly, just enough to throw the rear cabin into chaos. Megan fought the yoke with both hands. "Manual brakes," Doyle shouted. She was already pulling the levers. The deceleration was brutal. Seatbelt strained. Oxygen masks swung wildly above the passengers. Bags flew from overhead bins. People screamed, shouted, cried out. And still she held the line. The aircraft skidded for another 900 feet, metal on concrete groaning like a wounded beast. And then silence. They stopped. 43 feet from the tree line. Everything stood still. In the cockpit, Megan's hands were still locked to the controls, her breathing ragged. Doyle sat beside her, stunned, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. In the cabin, there was a full 3 seconds of dead silence. Then, from somewhere near the back, a small voice, "Did we land?" A single laugh broke the tension. Then a sob. Then applause, loud, shaky, disbelieving. People clapped, cried, hugged strangers. Flight attendants held each other. One of them dropped to her knees in the aisle and simply wept. Megan leaned back in her seat, eyes closed. Her body was shaking, not from fear, adrenaline leaving the system. Captain Doyle turned to her slowly, as if still processing what had happened. You just brought down a dead stick airliner on a mountain ridge with 181 people aboard." She gave the smallest smile. "Yeah," she said softly. "I guess I did." "Holy hell," he whispered. Outside, emergency crews were already sprinting toward the plane, headlights cutting through the darkness. Firefighters sprayed the smoldering rear engine with foam. Medics prepped stretchers. Police held back a crowd of stunned townspeople. Then the doors opened. Inflatable slides deployed. Flight attendants ushered passengers out as fast as possible. Some ran, some crawled. Others simply fell to the tarmac and kissed the ground. Megan stayed in the cockpit until every last passenger had left. When she finally stepped out, the cold mountain air hit her like a slap. She walked into the floodlights, surrounded by chaos, but strangely untouched by it. Her clothes smelled like smoke. Her hands were covered in soot. She didn't feel like a hero. She just felt present. A woman with 2 children ran up and mouthed, "Thank you," over and over. An elderly man saluted her through trembling fingers. A teenager stared at her like he'd seen a ghost. Megan nodded, not trusting her voice. Then the crowd parted. A single reporter already on site raised a microphone. "Mom, were you really just a passenger?" Megan paused. "Not today." She turned away from the lights, toward the darkness, toward the old mountain that had somehow become her runway. Back in the cockpit, her name tag was still missing, but everyone now knew who had landed that plane. The cameras came fast. Before the emergency vehicles had even cleared the runway at Mackenzie Ridge, news vans were already rumbling up the old mountain road. Drones circled overhead. Reporters lined the police barricade like vultures, mics outstretched, shouting questions into the cold dusk. "Ma'am, what's your name? Were you really just a passenger? Did you train for this?" But Megan Hale didn't stop to speak. She didn't want the moment. She didn't want the spotlight. While paramedics rushed to check the unconscious co-pilot, Megan found a quiet place by the fire truck. Someone handed her a water bottle. She sat down on the steel bumper and held it in both hands, trembling, not from fear, but from everything that had come after. The noise, the thank yous, the disbelief. It was almost too much. She looked back at the aircraft she'd just landed. A battered silver bird with scorched metal, shredded tires, and a tail that had no business being intact. It should have been a mass casualty. Instead, it was a miracle born not of luck, but of memory, instinct, and resolve. By the next morning, Megan Hale's name was everywhere. Passenger lands disabled jet in emergency miracle. Ex-Air Force cadet saves 181 lives. Mountain landing sparks national outpouring. Blurry photos taken by passengers mid-evacuation became headline images. Megan standing in the doorway of the cockpit, eyes alert, hands soot-covered, face flushed but focused. There was something raw and human about those images, something the nation clung to. By 9 a.m., her phone was flooded. Airline executives, military representatives, talk show hosts, agents, publishers, film studios. Everyone wanted a piece of the woman who'd done what most trained captains wouldn't even try. But Megan didn't answer any of them. She hadn't flown for fame. She hadn't grabbed the yoke to prove something. She had simply seen a gap, an absence of leadership, and stepped into it. That didn't make her special. It made her accountable. It wasn't until the 4th day, when Captain Doyle himself arrived at the firehouse where she'd been staying, that Megan agreed to a public appearance. "The FAA is holding a press conference," he told her, "in Eugene. Governor will be there. They're giving out citations. Honoring you." "I didn't do it for honors," she muttered. "I know," Doyle said. "That's why you deserve them." She said nothing for a long moment, then finally nodded. She owed the passengers that much. The conference hall was a sea of flashing cameras and polished podiums. Officials from the airline, the FAA, the Air Force, and even Congress gave carefully prepared remarks about heroism and courage. But all eyes were on Megan. When her turn came, she stood at the podium, steady but unpolished. No makeup, no stylist, no talking points. Just her. I was a passenger, she began. That's the truth. I boarded Flight 982 in coach, seat 17A, with no intention of touching a control stick ever again. She looked out over the crowd of journalists and dignitaries. I left the Air Force 6 years ago. I was told I didn't belong in high-pressure scenarios, that I wasn't built for leadership in crisis. She let that settle. Several reporters froze mid-note, but when the cockpit called for help, I went. Not because I thought I could do it better. Not because I wanted to be a hero. I went because someone needed to. She paused again. I didn't land that plane alone. Captain Doyle gave me space. The crew held the cabin together. The responders lit the runway. Every piece mattered. But yes, I flew it. I landed it. And I did it because I had to. Silence followed. Then thunderous applause. Later that night, while the internet buzzed with hashtags and hero montages, Megan sat alone in her motel room with a stack of unopened envelopes on the desk. Offers, book deals, movie rights, invitations to speak on television. But none of it mattered. What did catch her attention, however, was a small envelope addressed in pencil, no return address. Just the words, Megan Hale, Seattle. Inside was a handwritten letter. Dear Megan, my name is Sarah. I'm 12. I saw you on TV. My brother says girls can't fly planes. But I saw you do it. I want to fly one day too. I want to be like you. Megan's hand stopped trembling. She read the letter 3 more times, then reached for her phone, not to call a producer or a general, but to call the CEO of the airline. I don't want a PR tour, she said. I don't want a speaking contract or a TV deal. But if you mean what you've been saying about honoring what happened, then fund a flight school scholarship. A scholarship? The CEO asked, surprised. For girls, for minorities, for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong in the sky. There was a long pause. Then Doan. That week, the Megan Hale Flight Academy Fund was born. The first class of students came from all corners of the country, rural teens, inner-city dreamers, single mothers, veterans restarting life. The common thread. Every one of them had been told, "You're not pilot material." Megan knew the feeling. She didn't take a salary. She didn't want her name on a building, but she did show up, quietly, consistently, as a guest instructor. She taught not just the systems, but the silence between them. Not just how to land, but when to trust your gut. She taught decision-making under fire, calm under pressure, what it means to act when no one else moves. One student asked her once, during a break between simulations, "Why don't you want the medal?" She smiled and looked out at the runway. "Because a medal's a moment," she said. "But if I do this right, the next one who sits in that seat won't be doubted in the first place." And that was her legacy. Not the landing, but the doors she opened for others to walk through. 3 months after the landing at Mackenzie Ridge, the world had mostly moved on. The headlines faded. The interviews slowed. The frenzy that once swirled around Megan Hale, the passenger who landed the plane, was now just a memory to most. But for those whose lives she touched, her story had only just begun. At a small airfield outside Seattle, a new sound had started to fill the sky. Not the roar of commercial jets, but the steady hum of flight trainers. The kind of planes where futures take shape, slowly, carefully, 1 hour at a time. It was here in a modest hangar beside the Strip that Megan found her rhythm again. She wore no rank, no uniform, just a windbreaker-worn jeans and boots dusty from the tarmac. The back of her jacket read Hale Flight Academy, a quiet nod to what had grown from that single moment of decision over the Cascades. 12 students formed the first cohort of the Megan Hale Flight Fund. They came from everywhere: Detroit, Bakersfield, Omaha, Amarillo. Some were barely out of high school. Others well into their 30s, restarting dreams they thought were lost. And every one of them had something to prove. Not to the world, but to themselves. Megan didn't talk much about Flight 982. She never started her lessons with, "Back when I landed a 170-ton jet." She didn't need to. The students already knew. They had all seen the footage, read the articles, clipped the stories. But once they stepped into her classroom, or strapped into the 2-seat Cessna she used for drills, none of that mattered. She didn't teach fame, she taught focus. Pressure's not the enemy, she'd say. Losing your mind is. Her lessons were simple, but never easy. She taught students to read crosswinds by the bend of a tree line, to memorize emergency checklists until they could recite them in their sleep, to practice dead, stick landings until they were muscle memory. But more than that, she taught them to trust their instincts, to act when others freeze. That was what saved Flight 982. Not brilliance, not ego. Just action in the moment when everything else fell silent. One rainy afternoon in October, as Megan finished a debrief session with a pair of cadets, her assistant stepped into the room. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Says he was on your flight." Megan looked up, brow creased. "Flight 982. The assistant nodded. Outside in the lobby stood a teenage boy, tall, thin, soaking wet from the drizzle, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He looked up and offered a sheepish smile. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "Set 23C. Megan studied his face for a long moment. Then softly, "I remember." He stepped forward, nervous. "My name's Jacob. I was flying to Seattle to live with my dad. My mom had just passed. And that flight, I thought it was going to be the end of everything." Megan didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jacob reached into his bag and pulled out a beat-up composition notebook. He flipped it open to reveal pages and pages of sketches, cockpits, aircraft diagrams, checklists written by hand. "I've been learning everything I can. Manuals, simulators. I work part-time at a mechanic shop just to save for lessons." He looked up, eyes filled with something fragile but fierce. "I want to fly." Megan took the notebook from him and flipped through slowly. She saw the markings, the care, the obsession, not of a hobbyist, but someone who'd seen death close enough to know why it matters. "You've got the instincts," she said. Jacob's voice caught. "Yeah, but I don't have the money. Lessons, licenses. I figured maybe you could just point me where to start." Megan handed the notebook back and looked him in the eye. "You ever hear of the Hale Flight Fund?" He blinked. "You mean that's you?" She nodded. "Don't fill out the application," she said. "You're already accepted. Full tuition. Ground school, hours in the air." Jacob stared at her, speechless. Then, without warning, he hugged her, tight, sudden, full of every emotion he hadn't said. Megan hesitated only a second before returning the embrace. "You're going to fly," she whispered. "And not just that, you're going to lead." That evening, after Jacob left with his acceptance folder in hand, Megan sat alone in the hangar. The rain pinged softly against the roof. The runway lights outside glowed faintly beneath the fog. And in that quiet, she realized something. The most important thing she'd ever done wasn't landing a plane. It was showing someone else that they could. The next few years unfolded like a quiet revolution. Graduates of the Hale Fund took flight across the country. Some joined commercial airlines. Others flew medical missions, firefighting aircraft, or trained for search and rescue. Megan never bragged about their success, but she watched, proudly, silently. One day Jacob came back, license in hand, confidence in his stride, and a young girl trailing beside him, his sister. Her name was Olivia. She was 14, bright, quick, and carried a fire behind her eyes that reminded Megan of herself. "She wants to fly too," Jacob said. "She won't take no for an answer." Megan smiled. "Good." She brought Olivia up for her first trial flight the very next morning. As the small trainer lifted off into the golden light of a Pacific morning, Megan stood on the tarmac, arms crossed, boots planted. Her breath fogged in the air. Her heart, still quiet as always, beat with something deeper than pride. Legacy. Not a statue, not a headline, but a continuation. Lives changed because one woman didn't freeze when others did, because she saw a hole in the sky and decided she would fill it. That fall, Captain Doyle reached out again. "Flight 982 reunions next month," he wrote. "They want you in the front row." Megan typed her reply carefully, "I'll be there. But let them know I was never alone up there." And that was the truth. Because in that cockpit that day, there were more than just instruments and alarms. There was every instructor who believed in her. Every simulator hour logged. Every moment she'd been told she wasn't enough, and rose anyway. And now, years later, there was Jacob, and Olivia, and the dozens, soon hundreds, of pilots she would never fly with, but who would always carry a piece of her with them. The quiet woman who walked onto a plane as a passenger, and walked off having changed everything. There's something deeply human about Megan Hale's story. She didn't walk onto that plane wearing medals. She wasn't introduced as a war hero or a top-tier pilot. She carried no credentials in her hands, just a boarding pass and a coffee. But when everything fell apart, when the cockpit fell silent, and the world seemed one heartbeat away from tragedy, she stepped up. Not with bravado, not for applause, but because someone had to. That's the kind of courage the world doesn't always notice. The kind that doesn't come with spotlight interviews or grand speeches, but changes everything in a single, irreversible moment. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. You don't have to wait until someone calls your name. You don't need a title to make a difference. Whether you're 26 or 76, there will always be a moment when the room goes quiet and someone must choose to act. It might not be in a cockpit. It might be in a hospital room, a family emergency, a small town meeting, or just a stranger who needs a hand. But when that moment comes, don't look around. Look inward, because everything you've lived, everything you've learned, has brought you to that very point. And maybe, just maybe, you were meant to be there. If Megan Hale's quiet courage touched you today, leave a comment. What moment in your life asked you to step up when no one else would? Subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of resilience, humility, and the kind of strength that doesn't wear a uniform, but still saves lives, because some of the most powerful heroes are still flying under the radar.